Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala, the lessons in cultural studies. This is Pramod Kenar of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. We're going to be looking at part 2 of the key concepts and terms specifically to do with the idea of culture itself, where we'll be looking at culture, popular culture and mass culture. Let's recap quickly what we have already said. Culture is something we do by way of cultivation, of making things, of human endeavor. And in our case with cultural studies, we are interested in what they do by way of, say, making artwork, things for entertainment, and so on and so forth. Now, culture is divided into high and low cultures, where the culture of specific groups of people, the economically powerful elite, whose culture is then established as the definitive cultural form and automatically therefore rejects other cultural forms of the poorer people, of the working classes, as not worthy of consideration. The theoretical positions that culture studies scholars use are drawn from Marxist cultural theory, for which there is also already a lesson that you might want to take a look at. Specifically, the Marxist mode of thinking about economics and culture as being linked. In the case of the Frankfurt School, their arguments about the culture industry proposed that the culture of the masses is essentially something given to them because they are passive consumers. Culture is not something that they think about. Culture is what they assimilate automatically. Now, what this means in the larger context of cultural studies is culture is something we negotiate, we dispute, we fight about because it gives us a sense of identity, it gives us a sense of belonging, it gives us cultural citizenship, as we have discussed in part 1. However, because culture is also about power, we think of the loss of a cultural property, of cultural icons, of cultural practices as a loss of a sense of ourselves. For instance, the slaves in the plantations in the Caribbean in the New World discovered that their cultures were not part of, their songs were not a part of, their music was not a part of, what they were being told was culture. So the slaves reinvented their forms. They invented jazz versions of whatever they were doing. They converted their songs into more poetic forms, all of which was to say that you can't take this away from us. This is what we are. What I'm saying is that, effectively, if you were to think in terms of a particular group, ethnic or linguistic or religious group, their sense of belonging, their sense of being there as part of a group, relies on having a shared cultural identity. So the minute you take away this cultural practice, this cultural icon, then you take away their identity. It takes away their sense of belonging. This is precisely why there's always a battle over cultural property. Our icons that we believe bring us together. Some of you might remember battles over the Kohinoor as being Indian. And you cannot allow the British Museum to keep it, and they are actually ours. Why should we fight over a diamond other than for the obvious fact that it's a lucrative piece of jewelry? Because it's no longer just a piece of jewelry or a stone. It functions as a cultural artifact that all of us as Indians relate to. If you recall what we have said about national culture. So when we speak about culture, we are not speaking in terms of just great stuff for entertainment. We are speaking of something we relate and connect to because they tell us who we are, where we come from and where we are going. This is important also in the context of high cultural forms, incidentally. I'll go back to the example I used consistently through the previous, the part 1 of this talk, Shakespeare. Why does Shakespeare survive? Shakespeare survives because England needs Shakespeare to survive. England is associated with being the country of Shakespeare, the country of his birth, the country of where his works are, most of his works are situated, and so on and so forth. In other words, Shakespeare cannot be delinked from the sense of Englishness, from a sense of English identity. To be English is to know Shakespeare. I mean, I don't necessarily mean to know as in know intimately the works of Shakespeare, no. But you own him. You begin to say, this is what we are, because Shakespeare is ours. So suppose you take away Shakespeare and claim that he was not English. England will be very upset, primarily because its cultural identity, its sense of being a national togetherness as a community hinges on everybody agreeing that Shakespeare is English. Now, this is where it becomes important to understand that questions of culture are not questions of culture alone, they're questions of power, of identity. Because if you take away my cultural property, what I share with others, you take away my cultural memories, you take away a part of me. Now, immediately you can ask, but how do we all connect to these things? I have not seen the Republic Day parade. I have not seen who the king is or the president is. How do I connect to them? How do I sense a belonging? The answer is, culture spreads through various media forms. Culture requires representation, as we have already seen. Now, you will immediately dispute it by saying that in the ancient world there was no media. I mean, Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or any of the Maurya dynasty kings did not make use of Twitter to talk about themselves so that we can experience belonging. That's a wrong assumption. There was media in the old world as well. We do not recognize it as media. Let me take an example which perhaps you will readily understand. You all know that currency carries the face of somebody's face on it. You perhaps are aware that in the ancient world, the coins, the currency carried the face of the king. Why? Because the currency is the medium. It functions as a media that takes the face of the king to everyone. And everybody says, this coin, oh, but this is my king. You understand that this is your king because he exists on a coin, on a tablet of some kind. Declarations and proclamations are in the king's name. How do we know? Think of the oral poetry that has come down to us, songs of the time, which all involve a reference to the king. So the coins that we talk about of the ancient world, carrying the face of the king or the queen on them, are the media of that time. We now recognize our president or the king or whoever it is because the television shows us a photograph. In the pre-photographic times, somebody would carve it on a coin, on a stone. That's how we recognize it. So the medium has changed. The process has not changed. In other words, what I'm saying is, culture requires several mediated representations. They require a medium of transmission. Whether it is the recognition of a great football champion, a great film star, a very well-known astronaut or a king, all of these are made available to us and we connect to them nationally or globally or locally because we recognize them in a medium. What does that imply? It implies that whoever controls the medium controls the meaning of the cultural artifact. Suppose you do not put certain people's faces on television. Suppose you do not put their faces in the magazine. What does that mean? Now let me give you an instance here. Several of you are aware of a genre like the film magazine. What does a film magazine do? The film magazine gives you lots of information about films. Yes, it also does something else. It also brings you the life of the film star. It brings you the personal dimension of somebody you see only on the screen. I'm sure you're aware that several of the visuals in the magazine are photo shoots for which the film star actually has to pose. What does that mean? The film star is aware of the fact that he or she is brought closer to the audience in the form of these pictures, in the form of the write-up, the scandals, the gossip stories, whatever you want to call it. Without those, there is no film star. The film star is not only about the film icon on the screen. The film star is also somebody we understand, we know, we relate to because of what we see, because of what we recognize. This recognition is possible because there is a medium. Now we are talking recognition and we are talking medium, but where is the culture in all of this? The people who control the medium determine how we view a film star, a sports personality, a criminal. What does that mean? Culture relies upon icons, upon trends of seeing, about ways of perception, and the medium controls the ways we perceive these ones. Some of you must be aware of the fact that all celebrities have a certain humanitarian project. Save the Tiger. Princess Diana was famous for the campaign against landmines in Afghanistan and other parts of the world, right? What does this humanitarian project, this humanitarian side to them do? See, we always recognize them as film icons, sports icons from the specific field. But when they do this, our version, our perception, our view of what they are changes drastically. Oh, they also do these other things. Now, when you think carefully, what they are doing is acquiring what we spoke about in the other session. They acquire cultural capital. We recognize them not only as film star, but as people committed to a humanitarian, a political or a social cause, a social justice plank, a kind of project, an agenda. Icons are things that circulate independent of their profession. It could be the Nike swoosh, you all recognize it, the McDonald's Golden Arch, our national flag, all of them. An icon is a story. But it's interestingly a story that circulates independent of its origins. As in, do we ever ask, what does the national flag mean? Where does it come from? Who created the pattern? No, we don't. Why? Because it's assumed we all understand and we all belong to that flag, that particular icon which is up there. We are all here as part of the Indian community and the flag is right up there. The icon circulates independent of its origins, of the immediate medium. So wherever it goes, the national flag remains the national flag. Whether it's on the bonnet of the minister's car, on top of the building in the university or a public office, whether you put it as a badge on your coat, whether it's there on your notebook, the national flag is the national flag. The icon is something that possesses what has been called a semantic autonomy. Its meaning circulates independent of the medium. So the national flag on television is not different from the national flag in a stadium. It's still the national flag. We are not going to say, oh, but you know, this national flag on the television means something else. No, it does not mean anything else. It still means the national flag. In other words, what we are talking about is an icon carries a lot of value, weight, and meaning for all of us. We share it, we understand it, and we say, you know, that national flag, it means something to us. It means something to me. It means something to me individually. It means something to me as member of a group, member of a community, member of a nation. Popular culture is a very key domain in which these icons are manufactured and circulated. Let's leave aside the national flag. Think of film stars. Think of sporting personalities. Think of page 3 icons. What do? Well, several years ago, a critic said, a celebrity is a person who is well known for being well known. We don't know what they do, but they are well known because they are well known. That's all. They only need to be well known. And that is what popular culture does. Popular culture makes sure the icon is repeated day after day, medium after medium, in different formats, in different languages, in different versions. And it is because of that repetition, we all recognize, oh, that's an icon. We don't need a story. We don't need a footnote. We don't need an explanation. Popular culture survives. In fact, it thrives because of the repetition of the icon across time, across smaller cultural practices. The swoosh on the wall and the swoosh on your shoe still means Nike. The national flag, like I said, on your lapel, on the building, still means the national flag. That is what popular culture does. Popular culture makes sure that the media are used, the medium of print or whatever is used for us to relate to something. Now you understand what popular culture's significance is. It's not simply about entertainment. It is something about being together, connecting with things, being part of a community. Now you will say, how does consuming the national flag by viewing it become part of what we are or who we are or how we understand ourselves. Now, one strand of popular culture within culture studies looks at cultures of consumption, which could be food, fashion, or celebrities. Another strand is what I spoke about as well, the consumption of national spectacles, national identities. Now, you can ask, how is this consumption? Well, you see, we should not think of consumption as only what we buy in a store and put in our house or eat. No, consumption can also be what we consume as an idea, what we consume as a notion, a little notion. It is what we consume by just seeing visual spectacles that impose themselves on us. Consumption is a transaction. So please do not think of consumption as something which is out there, some product we buy and we eat and we are done. No, consumption is the establishment of a relation. Consumption is a transaction, a two-way dynamic between the people who make culture and the people who consume culture. It is because there are people who consume culture that there are people making culture. That's it. When the demand for disaster films goes up, every second week there is a disaster film releasing. For instance, between 2014 and 2016, if you look at the range of Hollywood releases in India itself, the superhero movie has been the most prominent. Why? Because there are more consumers for the superhero movie. Alongside that is the disaster film, the dystopian film, end of the world scenarios. It is because there are consumers that these are produced. So one cannot say that consumption is a passive inert act, whatever they manufacture we take. No. It is because we are willing to take that they are manufacturing. So we should think of consumption as a transaction, as a two-way process between the maker or producer of cultural artifacts and the consumer of this. Meaning exists in this particular transaction. It emerges in this particular transaction. You will notice that I have been using examples from around the world, not just from India. And that is specific to our present stage in cultural studies. And that is to do with the notion of the ramifications of popular culture in a globalized world. Global icons circulate. It could be David Beckham. It could be the Kardashian sisters. It could be Stephen Hawking, the scientist. It could be Donald Trump. It's also national figures, global events. When we speak about global warming may not happen to your locality. But we all understand it because eventually it can become our reality as well. Now, what are we talking about? We are talking about popular cultural forms that are part of a process of cultural globalization. Note what I said about consumption, that it's not just passive, it's a transaction. Now, globalization results in specific patterns of consumption. We can think of, say, Pepsi or pizza as an instance of globalization of one kind. But you also need to acknowledge the globalization of ideas. Now, unfortunately, in most cases, we think of cultural studies and its focus as entirely consumption of products and goods, whether it's fashion or food or film. That's not true. We also are part of an era of the globalization of ideas. In the recent past, I will give you an instance that should strike you as relevant. Think of the refugee crisis in Europe between 2015 and 2016, but also ongoing. How do we all know about it? See, the refugee crisis does not affect India directly. It does not come to us at our doorsteps directly. Yet in the age of globalization, in the age of mass media, we are all aware of the refugee crisis. We are all aware of why they are fleeing their countries. We understand their sufferings. We understand the problem of receiving European society saying, no, we have had enough, we cannot take any more. What are we talking about here? We are talking about the globalization of a crisis, the notion of a crisis, the globalization of suffering itself. Some of you might remember the visual of a small baby drowned off the Turkish coast, a toddler. Now, does it matter that the child is somebody we have never known? Does it matter that we do not know the child's name, its provenance, where it came from, where it was going? No, a child dead is a child's dead. Its circulation across the world triggered the response towards the refugee crisis, starting with the Pope all the way down. Now think of this as an icon of globalization as well. The drowned child in Turkey is also an icon of globalization. Please note what I'm trying to do. I'm moving you away from the idea of globalization in cultural studies as the study of only consumption of food and fashion and film into looking at other forms of consumption. Our consumption of global suffering, and in the recent past we can think of the kidnapping of 360 girls in Boko Haram in Sudan. We can think of earthquakes that happen in other parts of the world. We can think of massive train disaster or terrorist attacks. We can think of the drowned child. Globalization should also be read alongside these consumption patterns as something that brings home to us how other parts of the world also live. Let me quickly summarize what we have done so far. Popular culture should be analyzed not only as the availability of products for our consumption, but also as something that endorses a sense of belonging, something that gives us a sense of identity, something that tells us you are of this community, in this nation, in this day and age. So the culture industry argument as a theoretical position that we are passive consumers is not really tenable now. In order for us to have this sense of belonging, you need to see and consume this. And that requires mass media forms. Cultural studies' emphasis on mass media has to do with the circulation of icons, ideas, notions of belonging through various formats, through various means. Without media, there is no popular culture. Now, in the ancient world, even if there was no internet, there was no Twitter, and there was no instant transmission of visuals, data via, say, Instagram or Picasa, they were all aware of it because there were other means of circulation, like the minstrels, like the bards who went from village to village singing the songs, where in passing they mentioned their king. It has to do with the currency, it has to do with national festivals. Icons circulate through the mass media in this fashion. It's not organized, it disseminates across. It's not organized as in it cannot be predicted as to how it will go because people consume in different ways, especially in contemporary times. Icons are rallying points for us. When they are national icons like the flag or the national symbols or the national animal, we all say that is what we belong to. They can also function as rallying points for different ideas. Our examples would be, say, the Occupy campaigns, where Occupy, which is an empty place being occupied by people, becomes an icon for us. Now, this brings us to how we receive these ones. Popular culture requires that we pay attention to processes of production and of consumption. But as I've been arguing here, and I hope you have seen this, consumption is not only about the consumption of products. Consumption is not only about the consumption of films and entertainment and games and things like that. It's also about the consumption of ideas. It's about how we receive notions of somebody else's suffering, somebody else's humanitarian project, somebody else's disasters. When there is a disaster, the world comes together to do something about it. Why does that work? So effectively, it works because at that point, we again are consumers. But not consumers in the sense we buy, eat, throw it out. No. We are consumers of a very different order. And this is something we need to understand within cultural studies. We should not, I repeat, we should not think of cultural studies as focusing only on consumption as the consumption of entertainment, food, and leisure. There's also the consumption of ideas, the consumption of ethical positions, and the consumption of politics. In a globalized world, it's imperative for us to recognize this major shift. We consume the world's products, yes, like pizza, but we also consume the world's sufferings. Thank you.